Welcome to Page One, the show for writers with the reader in mind. Here's your host, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone, welcome to Page One. I'm Zita Christian. My guest tonight is a multi-published poet whose grace with words brings her first novel to life. The book is called Maps and Shadows, and it is fiction, but it is based on fact. The author is Krysia Jopek. Krysia, thanks very much for being on the show tonight.
Thank you for having me.
I love this book, and I'm so excited that we get to talk about it. The story itself is set in World War II, and that's a huge canvas against which to tell a story. So tell me what your story is about relative to that big canvas.
It's basically the story of my father's family's deportation from Poland to Siberia. It actually begins in 1939, very rural, pastoral, idyllic Poland before the war, and then the war starts, and they're deported in February of 1940. Soldiers come to the door, and it's the aftermath of that, being in Siberia for over 2 years and separated along different trajectories.
It's a gripping story, and I think it's important, especially with so many of the things in the news today about certain best-selling books that are coming to light that they might or might not be what they were claimed to be. So you freely say that this is fiction based on fact. So what part of it is fictionalized?
The publishers and we had some conversations about whether it's creative nonfiction or fiction, and I think creative nonfiction is an oxymoron, really. But because of all the books that, were proclaimed to be true and things weren't true in them, calling this a novel, everything in it is true with the exception of my aunt being a poet and taking a dictionary with her when they leave from Poland to Siberia. Those are my only pieces of poetic license.
And why that? I mean, I'm guessing because you are a poet, and
right.
It's a way for you to get your own voice in there. Is that the reason?
Absolutely. I definitely trained as a poet. I'm a poet at heart. I chose to write this as a novel to get a wider audience. And the character, my aunt Helen, loved literature, Polish literature and history. I just turned her into a poet and had her ripping out pieces of a dictionary and writing, because a big theme in the book is language, how language helps us survive. By writing her little pieces of poetry, or reminding herself that there's a word called hope in the dictionary.
Well, I could look at that and make the argument that you just took a little tiny bit of literary license, but I can also see from another perspective why, if you say that it is fiction based on fact, that covers everything. That gives you full green light.
I wasn't there,
Yes.
I can't say it's a memoir. I wasn't there. I just did all the interviewing and all the research, but...
Well, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. You weren't there. And so you hear about the story. Why do you think that it's important? Why was it important to you to write the story?
My father really never talked about his experiences until he retired. He really, I think, was too busy working and holding the family together. And I knew when I was very little, my father said to me, Tina, which is little one, brush your teeth, because we didn't have any toothpaste in Siberia, and I have dentures, brush your teeth. We didn't have toothpaste in Siberia. That was drilled in my head. So I knew my father was in Siberia. I didn't really understand why or the whole story until I was 19 and I was going to study in London, and we're looking at a map of London, and my father tells a complete stranger, another girl's father, oh yeah, I was 19, I was working in London as bellhop here. And the man says, why? And he tells him the whole story. And my mouth dropped, and I thought, how can you tell the stranger this whole story that I've never heard?
My guess is because the stranger would go away and there would be no questions asked afterward. But, of course, I also think there are no coincidences, and had he not wanted you to know the story, he could have said nothing.
Right.
How old was your father when he and the family were sent to Siberia?
He was not yet 12. He was almost 12.
And who all was in the family?
He was the middle child. His older sister was 3 years older. They had a little brother who was not quite 5, who remembers nothing. And then his parents, my grandparents, So it was a family of 5, mother, father, 3 children. My father was the middle, but he was the oldest male. So I think that changed
That's another dynamic.
his point of view.
So you hear this story, you're in London studying, and here your father is telling a total stranger a story about his life that you knew nothing about. Was that when you said, aha, I need to write this book, or did that come later?
Absolutely. I was shocked. I just thought, I need to know more. And I tried to read where I could, but I was in college, and I really started to do research after my master's in English when I had some time. I thought I would write the book in a semester before I started my doctoral, and that didn't happen. There was way too much to read and questions to ask.
So when did you start the book?
I started researching it in 1990, 91.
And did you have to ask your family members, was this true, or have them supplement the information or tell their version, anything like that?
I was very naive. I thought, I had my notebook and I went to my aunt's house and I said, okay, tell me the story. And she said, read this book. She gave me a book. Okay, I can read this book. I go read the book. I come back. Okay, now tell me your story. No, read this book. She gave me probably about 10 books to read, and then she would fill in the blanks for me.
Well, what were these other books?
Research, other basically narratives that people had gone through.
So somebody else's story.
They're referenced in the bibliography. One was a priest that was her friend. So they were books that she had access to that I would not have.
Oh, I see. I see. So in a way, it's like, yes, you can come into the story, but not through the door you're standing.
Right.
Yes, okay. Okay. So why do you think that it's important for this story to be told, and why now?
Because so few people know this piece of history. Even very recently, one of my college students, who's a history major, read the book and came up to me and said, I had no idea. People just don't know in this country the whole picture of what happened with Poland during World War II.
No, and I remember some of the information that I received from Aquila Polonica, your publisher. And they were wonderful, that condensing information, for someone like me, which made it very easy to do the interview, that 1.5 million people taken from their homes, many of them as your family, in the middle of the night and sent to Siberia for years to work in slave labor camps. And in another show, I was able to talk with your father and Henry, and with your Aunt Helen, and what moving stories, what tender, brave people. Yeah, I think it's very important that the world knows about this story. So what has been the family reaction now that the book is out?
It's been very interesting.
Yes.
I would say that my father didn't think I was going to ever finish it. And so when I did finish it, I think he was kind of not, believing that it was done. And actually, when I was writing, he said, "Oh, this is too poetic. Who's going to read this?" And so I remember when I finished it, he said, "I didn't think I'd be alive to see it." So I patted him and I said, "Thanks for hanging in there."
That's good.
But I think they're enjoying it. I think that, a lot of people in our town and community have seen, press releases, and they've bought the books, and they see my father in a different way now. And and for the family, just, my cousins have just sent me emails, thanking me, because they didn't know the story. Especially Joe, the one who was only 5, he's never said anything about what happened. He doesn't remember. He doesn't want to think about it. So for his children, to have this whole story.
It's a legacy. And it's not just a legacy for your family. It's for a community. It's for the entire Polish population. I think it's for any population that could be oppressed and,
Everyone has a story. I mean, I just hope that this, encourages other people to write down family history.
Family history is critical. And Krysia, because this is page 1, whenever I have a guest on the show who is an author, I always ask the author to read page 1 from the book. It gives people in the audience a chance to hear your voice in the book, but also because there are so many people in the audience who are also writers. And I know one of the big questions we always deal with is, well, where do I start the story? And I think it's important to hear how a writer chooses to tell the story, because Aquila Polonica thought enough of this book to publish it in hardcover and softcover at the same time. That's wonderful. In fact, let me just mention right now, if you're in the audience and you're thinking, I would love to get a copy of the book, or I want to be able to get in touch with Krysia, you can always contact her through the publisher, and you'll see the publisher's website frequently here on the show. So, Krysia, let me ask you first if you would read a little from that first page of chapter 1.
Sure.
One of the things I love is because you are a poet, the voice of the poet is very strong. It's beautiful.
Thank you. This is chapter 1, Our Orchards, from Henrik's point of view, Eastern Poland, 1939 to 1940. Some dates change the world irrevocably. What is done cannot be undone, no matter how well or ill conceived. 1 plane or 2 or 10, piercing invisible lines, seeking enemy flesh. A page of history that can never be torn out permanently. Things tend to catch up, even when they are buried or ripped out, and it's impossible for people to go on the same, though many pretend while sweeping the ashes under the expensive silk carpet. It depends where the lines are drawn, maps and agreements that may or may not be honored, upheld, memory selective. Paper and flesh can be burned. The history books my sister Helcha loved would become unreal, unwritten. The Helcha that was light flipped her honey hair and skipped with her books about lost cities, golden ash, before the stone pages made her heavy. The then unwritten pages that would unfold us, one group of people fighting another, the variables, teams, and players switching, faking the others out. The fading hours of twilight fell quickly that late summer of 1939. I was 11.5 years old, and like the other boys of my Asada village, had that feeling of youthful invincibility burgeoning in every vein. There was an ominous sense that the village talk of another large-scale war would come to fruition, but we shook that thought off gallantly. We were too busy playing our own war games, striving to be like our fathers, who were all decorated war heroes before we were born. The wind unsettled the pine trees and disheveled the girls' long hair. Asha, Kaja, Magdalena, Magosha, Dorota, Helcha, and her friends. My peers and I didn't know exactly when it happened, our new interest in how the light transformed the shades of their hair from molasses to amber to honey, and in the new subtle curves of their bodies. We could hear them laughing in the distance, there in the intricate spaces of a neighbor's farm. Their hushed giggles intrigued us, but we remained awkward around them, afraid of appearing foolish. So we poised ourselves, hoping to get a distant glimpse, a keyhole into their world. "Come in, Sinu, my son, supper on the table," my father summoned from afar. He was more than likely still feeding our farm animals. I could barely hear the newborn sheep bleating to be fed. They were born a few days ago and still wet from birth. Our watchdog Hollis, named for his noisiness, barked also, fulfilling his job to keep foxes and other predators away from our horses, sheep, pigs, and chickens. I had finished cleaning the barn about a half hour prior. Father and I tried to alternate between cleaning and feeding. His call to me signaled he was almost finished feeding all our livestock.
You know what? Thank you. I love your voice. I love the way you write. It is poetic and it is clear, and you manage so beautifully to capture that point of view of a 12-year-old boy. And for the story itself, I think here he's 12, his older sister about 15, and it's a time when there's so much possibility. I mean, I think about young people now and what they would be thinking about at that age, and envisioning what their future is going to be like, and then of course everything changes on that night when the Russian soldiers come to the door. You do use multiple points of view in the story, and what you just read for us from Henry's point of view, who at the time was 12, how many other points of view are in the story?
There are 4 points of view. There's my father, his sister, his father, and his mother. So it's male, female, and then it repeats. So it's not, changing all that many times. There's 8 chapters, so you get 1 chapter in each of the 4 points of view, and then it's repeated, and then a coda. So I like to think of it as a quartet.
Oh, that's beautiful. So it's a musical as well. Why did you choose the multiple points of view?
I knew I had to write in different points of view because the family split up and they had completely different trajectories geographically.
Where did they go?
After they were in Siberia, they're separated. My grandfather leaves first to try to join the military, leaving them behind. They end up making the trip to Uzbekistan, very tough trip. and my father sent to military school in Persia, or actually in Palestine was a country at the time, and the women and children are sent to Tanzania. So I needed the different points of view for that. And then also interviewing my father and my aunt, I realized I'm getting different stories because, you know, experience is subjective, memory.
Yes, many truths.
Yes. So, you know, I would get some discrepancies and then I'd have to go back to the other one, and just very different from their ages and different genders and just their role in the family.
So that choice of multiple point of view was something you made as you got into the writing, or was it a conscious choice from the very beginning?
I knew from the beginning.
Okay. Now, Aquila Polonica, your publisher, specializing in the Polish experience of World War II. When I was looking through the press kit, Terry Tegnazian, the president and co-founder, said, "We've noticed that women readers who have not traditionally been the dominant consumers of war literature, but who are the dominant buyers of books, are attracted by first-person storytelling that illuminates the human side of war." Why do you think that's so?
I think that most war literature isn't written from a female point of view. Aquila Polonica has some other books that do that. I find it interesting whenever I tell someone I have a novel, they assume it's chick lit, and then I get to say, no, it's about World War II, and that kind of takes them aback. And I think the voices that I've chosen, the different genders, allow for male and female readers to be sucked into the story.
And you do that really well. I want to ask you about the reader's guide, because you do have a reader's guide that's included at the back of the book. And there was one question about the lasting effects of the family's exile from Poland on each of the four characters. Can you talk a little bit about how that experience affects the next generation? And I understand that is I think a question, a great question to ask for people who are reading the book and maybe in book clubs and book discussion groups. But you've had the up close and personal way of observing. So when you look at your father's experience, Henry, your Aunt Helen's experience, what then comes down to you, the daughter?
I think that researching and writing the book, and my cousins will attest, that I learned where I came from, why I am the way I am, because of how my parents, my father stressed education more than anything. Not having excess, not having extra things, not taking things for granted. And I think that it's very important for this generation and the generations to come to realize what life was like when there weren't cell phones and et cetera, and just how much we take for granted in this country.
Well, there's a scene in the book where the Russian soldiers come in the middle of the night. They're pounding on the door. They come in, bayonets are drawn. They're waking up the family. They tie, they tie your father's father to a table with his face against the wall so he can't see what's happening. And I think about that scene, and then the soldiers tell your mother to pack what you can carry and bring warm clothing and bring food for 6 months. And how many times, you go to writers' conferences or there's how-to articles about creating characters, and one of the things that always comes up is, well, if your character had to leave, if the house were on fire and your character had to leave, what would she grab? So did any of that occur to you when you were doing the research for this and thinking, what would I have taken? What would I take now if that were the situation?
The dictionary.
The dictionary,
The dictionary, the book that you take on the island when you're deserted. The Encyclopedia of Man. How can you get bored? Every word's in there. But it's interesting that you mentioned the scene where my grandfather's tied, because another thing with getting the multiple points of view, that's a pivotal experience in the book, and you hear that experience from each character, because it's a boy seeing his father tied and trying to step up to the plate and being the man of the family. And imagine the father being tied with his back to them. And you must lose a bit of your manhood knowing your wife has seen you tied to the table.
And he can't defend her should that need Fortunately, in that situation, it did not. We have a few more minutes left, Tricia, and I want to ask. I marked another spot in that book, and I would love it if you would read the second green tag, because it gives another perspective from another character.
This is from chapter 4, from Zofia's point of view, my grandmother. It's called Train Again, en route south to Uzbekistan, 1941. Stay inside while the men fight the cold, walking to the frozen forest. Stay in the cabin and stay busy. Cook a meal out of dried mushrooms and dried fish. If not so fortunate, improvise porridge again without using too much of the remaining flour. Pretend that it is all okay, that the porridge does not taste like glue. Look Joseph carefully in the eyes with a look that says, "Don't worry, my youngest, we'll go home." It's not lying, it's survival. Sweep, sweep, sweep. Keep the dust and thoughts away. Don't let the children know you are afraid. Keep time going, flowing forward and not back again to the farm, the lovely ripening trees bearing apples, plums, and pears, those delicate hours of tree light and sun. Sweep, sweep, sweep. There's a rhythm to keep time going so as not to stop and grow torpid, heavy with despair. Time didn't pull as it used to on our farm, our orchards. Time used to pass swiftly. The children somehow grew up right in front of our eyes, but now time stopped. Growth stopped. 2 interminable winters in Siberia had taken a toll on all of us. At least it was finally summer, almost 2 full years after the war had started. Henrik and Helen were in the forest picking blueberries and mushrooms that I would drive for next winter. Joseph was still sulking because I wouldn't let him go with his older brother and sister. There would be a next winter, we hoped, though we prayed not in Siberia. I wasn't sure we could survive another winter in the Arctic taiga, but somewhere, perhaps back on our farm in Poland. But Andrei believed we would never return. He could not go through another deportation, another instance of being tied in front of his children. It was gambling, the communist deck stacked to win. Andrei missing behind his eyes, smoking his pipe, walking and looking nowhere. He had aged in the last 18 months. We all had, I did not want to admit, yet he the most. Helcha and Henrik acted more like adults than children. Their silliness, once embodied in Henrik's games and Helcha's songs, were truncated, left in a different life, those former versions of ourselves lost. School for the children was jerry-rigged. The children who, more so than usual, as typical children in school, found it difficult to concentrate. Yet were happy to be learning again, sitting in ordered rows, makeshift desks. Henrik missed the orchards, and Helcha, her routine on the farm, singing hello to rooster, hen, her interrupted 16-hood. And Joseph, too young to know, he was the luckiest or perhaps the most scarred. Every week, if possible, I had tried to barter an item of clothing, such as a pair of stockings, a pillowcase, a curtain, or whatever I could, in exchange for 1 or 2 pints of milk for Joseph. On occasion, I exchanged my sewing and mended a pair of pants or a coat for one of the locals' children. The mothers understood how important this milk was for my youngest, and the word traveled among them. If they weren't able to trade, they helped to find another woman who could. I was incredibly grateful for their empathy. I didn't feel like I was begging anymore, as the first time when I asked shamefully, unable to meet their glances.
Oh, Krysia. You know, this is what I love about the story. You take an experience, and with the detail, such intimate, telling, descriptive details, you make it all come alive. It's absolutely beautiful. I'm curious, when you finished, well, let me go back a minute. Each of the chapters, does each chapter open with a piece of your poetry, the way the 2 excerpts you read for us?
The 2 excerpts that I read, the first part of the excerpt was in italics, which is kind of prose poetry, which I kind of learned from Hemingway and a couple other writers. And in addition to that, there's poems that I didn't read. There's actually Helen's poems interspersed throughout. So in front of every chapter, you get a poem of Helen's describing, being on the train or being in Africa.
Tell me about what it was like when you finished writing, when you hit the end. What did you do?
I think I was a little shocked. I mean, I sent it out. I read it over and over and over again. I mean, I've read this book probably 50, 100 times, just page by page.
Sure.
But just so grateful that I forced myself to finish. And, I wanted the story to be out while my family was still, around.
Did you send it to any publishers other than Aquila Polonica? I mean, they seem to be the perfect one because this is what they focus on, the Polish experience in World War II.
I sent it to a few different publishers. It's been a learning experience for me. I kind of understand the whole business better. I really lucked out that Aquila Polonica specializes in Poland in World War II. So I was very, very lucky that they, loved the book and were willing to take it on.
What was the editorial experience like?
A lot of notes, a lot of historical notes and quibbling over words and I enjoyed it for the most part. Sometimes I had to hold my ground at the end and say, no, I like the way that word sounds poetically. But I'm glad that, I had historians reading the book and fact-checking. And
yeah, there's a lot to it, isn't there? Yeah. What's next for you?
My second book is done. I'm just tweaking the second half of it.
What's that about?
It's called The Glass House of Forgetting. And it's a novel that takes place in a glass bed and breakfast on an island off Tunisia. And it's a bed and breakfast where people go to forget horrible things that have happened. The proprietors have, lost a daughter under circumstances that, even aren't clear. There's different stories of what really happened to her. But their friend, an architect, designs this building to help them forget because of the ocean. And so you get a series of guests who come and heal.
So I would immediately think, okay, this is fiction, but is there any part of this that is based on fact?
I mean, of course, there's always things, there's a man from Japan after World War II. There's a woman, a cellist, who can't play the cello anymore, which is based on someone I went to grad school with. So there are definitely pieces of truth. But there is no glass house, as people in my writing group wanted to know. Where is it?
Well, okay, now that brings up another question, because as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of people in the audience who are writers. So you are a member of a writers group, a group that critiques, gives feedback?
I'm a member of two groups. I kind of go on and off. One's a larger group, one's a smaller group. I write well by myself. I like to have someone exchange manuscripts with.
It's always helpful to get those fresh eyes in there. Well, Krysia, I really appreciate your being here on the show tonight and sharing the information about Maps and Shadows. It's a beautiful book, a beautiful family story, and what a legacy you leave for everyone. Let me just say also thank you to my crew, and especially to Jessica Batchelor, who is filling in for us tonight. I really, really appreciate that. And finally, let me close with the words of the fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin, who said, "There have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories. So find your story or your family's story and find a way to tell it. And do join us again next time. Thank you."
Food for the crew and guests was provided by Manchester Grill of Manchester, Connecticut, and Angelo's Restaurant of Glastonbury, Connecticut. Be sure to send your writing questions and your comments on the book club selection to Zita at page 1, P.O. Box 1515, Manchester, Connecticut, 06045-1515, or send an email to Zita at page1tv.com.